At 6:55 in the morning on March 19, 1945, the United States Navy aircraft carrier USS Franklin was steaming at approximately 23 knots in formation with Task Group 58.2 about 50 miles east of the Japanese home island of Honshu, closer to the Japanese mainland than any other American carrier had operated during the Pacific War. Her air group had launched a fighter sweep against Honshu and was preparing a second strike against shipping at the Kure naval anchorage. Her flight deck and her hangar deck below were crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, ordnance dollies, fuel hoses, and bomb carts. The morning launch was running on a tight cycle. At 6:58, a single Yokosuka D4Y suicide dive bomber, a Judy in U.S. Navy reporting code, broke through the carrier's combat air patrol, came in over Franklin's flight deck from the cloud base at approximately 1,000 feet, released two 550-pound bombs and pulled away. Franklin's defending gunners did not have time to engage. The bombs hit the flight deck and penetrated into the hangar deck below. The first bomb detonated among armed aircraft being prepared for the second strike. The second detonated in the after end of the hangar. What followed was the worst single-incident damage suffered by any United States Navy warship of the war that nonetheless came home. The chain detonations in the hangar deck began within seconds of the bomb hits. Armed aircraft loaded with 500-pound bombs, 1,000-pound bombs, rockets, and machine gun ammunition cooked off in sequence as the fires spread aft and forward through the hangar. Aviation gasoline lines ruptured. Two of Franklin's portside engineering spaces lost steam pressure within minutes. The carrier's main electrical buses failed. Her radios went silent. She lost steering. Her hull took a sharp 13-degree list to starboard from the weight of accumulated firefighting water and from the loss of buoyancy in the after-engineering compartments. Her flight deck was buckled in two places by the secondary explosions. Aircraft on the after end of the flight deck began to roll off the side as the list increased. Crewmen were thrown into the sea by the blasts. The Japanese pilot of the D4Y, identified after the war as Lieutenant Junior Grade Yasuhito Banno of the 762nd Naval Air Group, did not survive the war and was never personally interviewed about the engagement. His squadron's after-action report described a successful attack on a large American carrier at coordinates matching Franklin's position. The Franklin's commanding officer at the moment of the attack was Captain Leslie Edward Jayers, a former enlisted naval aviation pilot who had been commissioned as an officer and given command of the carrier in November 1944. Jayers was on the bridge when the bombs hit. He was uninjured. Within minutes he understood the situation. His carrier was on fire from end to end of the hangar deck, was dead in the water with a 13-degree list, had no radio, no power, and no propulsion, was carrying approximately 3,000 officers and men of whom an unknown but large number were dead or trapped below, and was 50 miles from the Japanese coast in waters the Imperial Navy could be expected to reach within hours. He had two operational alternatives. He could order abandon ship. He could fight to save the carrier. He chose the second. The senior crew members who would carry the decision were already at work below. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Timothy O'Callaghan, the Franklin's Catholic chaplain, was at his prayer cabin near the wardroom when the bombs hit. O'Callaghan was 45 years old, a Jesuit priest from Boston who had volunteered for naval service in 1940 and had been assigned to the Franklin in late 1944. He was, at the moment of the attack, the only chaplain in the U.S. Navy. He understood within minutes that the conventional duties of his commission, administering last rites to the dying, comforting the wounded, conducting religious services, would not be sufficient to what was happening around him. He spent the next several hours moving through the fire-damaged compartments of the carrier, organizing crew members into damage control parties, leading the manual jettisoning of armed bombs and rockets that had not yet cooked off, administering last rites to dying men, and physically leading the work of bringing fires under control. His Medal of Honor citation, awarded by President Truman in January 1946, describes specifically his leadership of damage control teams under continuous risk of secondary explosion. Lieutenant Junior Grade Donald Arthur Gary, a former enlisted machinist's mate from Findlay, Ohio, who had been commissioned as an officer in 1942 and had been serving as an assistant engineering officer aboard Franklin, was below the hangar deck at the moment of the attack. He felt the explosions. He understood within seconds that his immediate problem was the 300 crew members trapped in an enlisted men's mess on the third deck, sealed in by closed watertight hatches and the spreading fires above them. Gary organized the men in the dark, used a hand torch to find a route through the burning compartments, and led the 300 men individually, in small groups, over a 6-hour period through a route that took them through the damaged decks and up to safety on the carrier's foredeck. After completing the rescue, he went below again and into the burning No. 3 fire room, where he relit a boiler that had failed, raised steam pressure in one engineering loop, and gave Franklin the ability to begin restoring her own electrical power. His Medal of Honor citation describes the rescue and the boiler relight. The damage control work proceeded through the morning of March 19 and into the afternoon. The fires on the hangar deck were brought under control by approximately 3 p.m. that day. The list was reduced from 13 degrees to 9 degrees by selective counterflooding of starboard compartments. The starboard engineering plant was restored to limited operation by early evening. By midnight, Franklin had 2 boilers operating, could maintain 6 knots, and had begun to recover her radio communications. The carrier was still on fire in places. She was still listing. She had 807 dead and 487 seriously wounded aboard. She was being towed at 6 knots by the cruiser USS Pittsburgh on a southerly course away from Honshu. By the morning of March 20, Franklin was making her own way at 15 knots under her own power, retrieving her own air group from the cruiser that had been recovering them, and steaming with Task Group 58.2 toward Ulithi Atoll for emergency repairs. The voyage home that followed was, in its quiet way, as remarkable as the engagement itself. The Franklin's crew, working from emergency damage control plans that had been written into the U.S. Navy's institutional doctrine since the lessons of the carrier Lexington at Coral Sea 3 years earlier, brought their ship through interim repairs at Ulithi, across the Pacific to Pearl Harbor, through the Panama Canal, and to the Brooklyn Navy Yard at New York. Franklin arrived at Brooklyn on April 28, 1945. She had steamed roughly 12,000 nautical miles under her own power from the position of the bomb hit to the East River Pier. Her crew, the great majority of whom had been aboard at the moment of the attack, brought her in. The dock workers at Brooklyn who watched her come in described, in post-war interviews, a ship that looked as though she had been hit by an artillery bombardment from end to end. They could not understand, looking at her, how she was still afloat. The casualty figures were the operational fact that mattered. Of approximately 3,000 officers and men aboard Franklin at the moment of the bomb hits, 807 were killed, 487 were seriously wounded, and the remainder were either lightly wounded or untouched. The dead included nearly all of the air group personnel who had been on the hangar deck preparing the second strike. The dead also included nearly all of the personnel who had been in the engineering spaces directly under the bomb hits. The 807 killed in action was the highest single-incident casualty figure of any United States Navy ship in the war that nonetheless returned home. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey's post-war review of Pacific naval losses listed Franklin specifically as the most heavily damaged carrier to survive the war by any measure of damage tonnage, structural displacement, or casualty rate. Captain Jayers took some criticism for the conduct of the engagement in the months that followed. He had, in the immediate aftermath of the attack, divided the crew into those who had stayed aboard during the worst of the fires and those who had jumped into the sea and been rescued by the cruisers. Jayers referred publicly to the second group as the 404 Club, implying a kind of moral distinction between those who had remained on the burning carrier and those who had not. The implication was unfair to many of the men in the water, who had been blown overboard by the blasts or had been ordered to evacuate damaged compartments through which the fires had cut off any alternative route. Several of Jayers's officers and a substantial fraction of the surviving crew objected to the implication. The Navy's institutional review of Jayers's command quietly noted the issue but did not prejudice his subsequent career. He retired in 1949 as a rear admiral. The 404 Club terminology has been the principal point of post-war controversy about Franklin's loss. The damage control performance of the ship, the heroism of the crew, and the engineering work of the rescue have not been seriously contested in any historical account. The Franklin herself never returned to operational service. She was placed in reserve at the Brooklyn Navy Yard in 1947, mothballed through the post-war period, and was eventually struck from the Navy list in 1964 and scrapped at Newport News, Virginia in 1966. None of her hull was preserved. Her bell, her ship's badges, and several smaller artifacts are at the Naval Surface Warfare Center at Indian Head, Maryland, and at the National Naval Aviation Museum at Pensacola. Father O'Callaghan returned to Holy Cross College in Massachusetts after the war and lived until 1964. Donald Gary returned to civilian life in Ohio and lived until 1977. Captain Jayers lived in San Diego until 1975. The combat air patrol failure that allowed the D4Y to reach Franklin's flight deck unopposed deserves a careful note. Task Group 58.2, on the morning of March 19, 1945, was operating about 50 miles east of Honshu in a low-altitude cloud deck that limited radar tracking of inbound enemy aircraft. The standing combat air patrol over the task group was provided by F-6F Hellcat fighters from the Franklin's own air group and from the carriers operating in formation with her. The radar plot aboard Franklin had detected an incoming Japanese aircraft track at approximately 6:40 a.m. and had vectored the on-station Hellcat patrol toward the contact. The Hellcat patrol had intercepted at approximately 12,000 feet and had engaged what the Hellcat pilots reported as a small group of D4Y dive bombers and Mitsubishi A6M0 escorts. The intercepted aircraft were genuine targets, but the intercepting Hellcats did not detect that at least one D4Y had separated from the main attack group and was approaching at low altitude under the cloud base, using the cloud cover to mask itself from radar. The Franklin's after-action report noted the gap in radar coverage. The Pacific Fleet's institutional review noted the operational lesson and revised low-cloud radar coverage procedures for the remainder of the war. The lesson was a familiar one, that radar gaps at certain altitudes against certain weather conditions could allow individual aircraft through, and the Franklin's loss was, in the Navy's review, principally an outcome of those gaps rather than of any individual error in the carrier's defensive procedures. A specific moment of damage control aboard Franklin deserves to be described. At approximately 7:30 a.m., roughly 35 minutes after the bombs hit, the carrier's after magazine, containing approximately 40 tons of high-explosive ordnance for the air group's strike, was reported to be near critical temperature. The compartment had been flooded by the damage control teams within 15 minutes of the bomb hits as a precautionary measure, but the magazine cooling system had failed and the flooding water was beginning to boil. The Franklin's gunnery officer, Lieutenant Stanley Graham, recognized within minutes that the magazine could not be allowed to detonate. He ordered the magazine compartment opened from above, the water level checked, and a backup cooling system improvised using fresh water from the carrier's drinking water reserves. Graham's team worked in the compartment under continuous risk of detonation for approximately 90 minutes. The magazine did not detonate. Graham was awarded the Navy Cross for the action. The detail is one of dozens of similar small actions performed by Franklin's crew across the morning of March 19 that, taken together, kept the carrier from blowing apart. The towing operation by USS Pittsburgh produced its own small operational story. Captain John H. Gingrich of the Pittsburgh had brought his heavy cruiser alongside Franklin at approximately 9 a.m. on March 19 and had passed a towing cable to her. The cable was secured to Franklin's bow at approximately 10 a.m. Pittsburgh began towing at approximately 10:30 a.m. On a southerly course at 6 knots, the maximum speed Franklin's damaged hull could safely tolerate. The towing was complicated by Franklin's continued 13-degree list, which made the towing cable strain unevenly, and by the necessity of maintaining the formation's defensive screen against further Japanese air attack. Pittsburgh towed Franklin for approximately 7 hours, until Franklin had restored sufficient steam pressure in her own engineering plant to make her own way at 6 knots. The cable was cast off at approximately 5 p.m. on March 19. By the morning of March 20, Franklin was making 15 knots under her own power and was no longer dependent on tow. The Pittsburgh's tow had carried Franklin approximately 40 miles south, into waters where the Japanese air response would have been more difficult, and had given Franklin's engineering crew the time to restore the boiler that Lieutenant Gary had relit. Pittsburgh herself returned to her station in the task group screen without further incident. The strategic context of the engagement was the Task Force 58 strikes on the Japanese home islands in March 1945. Task Force 58, under Admiral Mark Mitcher, was conducting a sustained series of airstrikes against airfields, naval bases, and shipping at Kobe, Kure, and the Tokyo area in support of the upcoming Okinawa invasion. The strikes were intended to suppress Japanese air activity at the home island bases that would otherwise be used to launch attacks on the American invasion fleet at Okinawa. The Japanese air response was vigorous, Through March 1945, a number of American carriers were hit by suicide and conventional attacks. Franklin's loss was the most severe of these. The strategic outcome of the March 1945 strikes was nonetheless successful. Japanese air strength at the home island bases was substantially degraded by the time of the Okinawa landings on April 1, 1945, and the kamikaze response against the Okinawa invasion fleet was thereby reduced from what it would otherwise have been. Franklin's contribution to that outcome was, in the operational accounting, real. The lesson of the Franklin is one the Navy's institutional history has retained without major modification since 1945. The lesson is that an Essex-class fleet carrier, hit hard enough to lose 800 crew and to be left dead in the water 50 miles off an enemy coast, can nonetheless be brought home by her surviving crew if the damage control doctrine is in place, and the engineering and medical and chaplaincy personnel know what they are doing and are willing to do it. The Franklin's crew brought her home. The doctrine that allowed them to do it was the operational legacy of the lessons Lexington and Yorktown had paid for at Coral Sea and Midway. The Franklin's bell is in Pensacola. The men who saved her are mostly gone. The fact of the saving is in the institutional record of the United States Navy and has not been forgotten in the 80 years since.